Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Ash and myself are discussing programming for performance. So it's a real fun subject that I think we both have a passion for, since we get to program for many different types of people, whether they are competitive athletes or your everyday athlete. Everyone has their own needs and requirements. So I think we really need to understand the starting thing is about programming in general. So what would you say is probably the number one thing that our listeners need to be making sure that their program includes? Probably the king. What would you say?
The king is undoubtedly progressive overload. I think whether you're a competitive athlete or you're just an everyday athlete going to the gym just to be a little bit fitter, making sure that you're constantly improving is the key to getting any sort of result. You need to make small, consistent progression and constantly create the stimulus for the adaptation that you desire. So if you want to be getting stronger in the deadlift, you need to be asking your body to deadlift a little bit more in some way, shape or form every time you go to the gym. It might not always happen. You might have a bad day, bad week, whatever, but long term, over time, that progressive overload principle applies to every aspect of training, whether it's a high skill movement, it's pure strength, it's pure fitness and cardio. You want to be asking your body to adapt to be better.
Yeah, and I guess I think a big thing about that is the word progressive. So the fact that you understand that this is a journey rather than a destination, that you're going to be progressing week in and week out, hopefully, even if it is a little bit of a step back at times, you're still progressing in one way or another. Now, I think the problems is where, especially when people come to training as a newbie athlete in a way, and they're learning a skill, I think that can be a big misrepresentation of progressive overload, because I think there can be big leaps in strength. And they're like, fuck yeah, I just put 20 kilos on my back squat. Yeah, like that means if I did that in 6 weeks, I'm going to have 100 kilos more. Oh, I can't wait to get all this. You're like, okay, cool, hold your horses a little bit. But I think it's a good passion to have and a good idea, but to understand that maybe where your 20 kilos turns only to 10 kilos after 6 weeks, then might only turn to 5. Then it might be you're stuck on a weight for 3 months, for example. Then to not be downhearted about that, because when you are new to training, you're going to have so many other progressions going on internally, externally, and understanding of the movement. There's so many other things than just muscle breakdown and muscle strengthening and recovery and so forth. So I think that's really key. So if you are making big leaps and you're a relatively seasoned trainee, you need to ask yourself, cool, have I earned the right to be there yet? It's like, for an example, if you have a 90 kilo snatch and then you go and you're in a competitive environment, even if it's in the gym and everyone's around you and somehow you snatch 100 kilos, it's like, okay, cool, you've snatched 100 kilos. That's a great little mark off. But now you're not someone that can snatch 100 kilos regularly. You're just someone that hit it once. Just like with the open, it's a great example. When people get their first muscle up on the rings, it's like, oh, great, I've got a ring. It doesn't mean you can now do ring muscle ups. What that now means is you've got yourself on top of the rings. Now you need to start really honing your skills so you can become the person that can do ring muscle ups.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the other thing to be said about the big leaps is that, yeah, it is unsustainable. Like physiologically, the body can only adapt at a certain rate. So if you are slapping on 20 kilos to your lift every week or every month, you can only get away with it for so long before you reach a ceiling. And when we're thinking about creating a stimulus for the body, the dose needs to be correct. So it needs to be hard work. You need to be struggling to finish the work that's been prescribed, but it can't be so over and above your current level that shit starts to go wrong. That's where injuries happen. That's where you can develop really bad compensation patterns, because you're just trying to find the strength from somewhere, from anywhere, to get the movement done. So having the right amount of challenge where we do ask the body to adapt and become fitter, stronger, faster, but not so much that technical breakdown occurs and then you start ingraining and practicing bad habits, which will actually hold back your progress long term. So it's very much another tortoise and hare situation where slow, steady progress trumps huge, quick leaps long term.
Yeah, I think that's a really common thing, and I think also that kind of goes into the idea of where pacing comes in. I think, like progressive overload, and like even when you're looking at, say, your cardio system and getting better at something, if you're going balls to the wall at the start of a workout, are you going to progressively overload the body by doing more, say, of a set exercise for more reps? Or because you've gone balls to the wall, you're broken down so much that then you'd say, for instance, you've got some assault bike and wall balls and you're absolutely gassed and some pull-ups, right? So you're doing those movements and then you get to the pull-ups and you happen to do singles and stuff like that. Then you got to ask yourself, maybe if you eased off on the assault bike at the start, you'd actually now be performing more pull-ups. So then you'd be progressively overloading that movement. And then when you get to the wall balls, you're sweet. Because again, you've been able to get through these positions rather than just absolutely gassing yourself. But don't get me wrong, there's a time and a place to absolutely end yourself. But it's that understanding of your overall goal and your whys in what direction you want to go in. But I think that progressive overload should be number one, that everyone needs to look at their training and their programming and say, cool, am I looking to get better a little bit day in, day out, week in and week out, and month in and month out? And is there a clear direction to my training? I think that's sometimes it can be, it's happened to myself where my own training, I've looked at it and I realize I'm just kind of spinning my wheels. I'm not pushing myself. And sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes you need a little bit of like a step back in a way to kind of maybe realign and refocus maybe a different direction. But as long as you're kind of trying to still keep moving in that direction, I think it's key. So I think so as another principle, I guess we also have intensity and volume.
Yeah.
So Ash, what would be something that you might want to give our listeners an idea when they have to think about intensity and volume? What's the difference between the two?
So volume is the total amount of work that you're doing, and intensity is how hard is the work. It's the simplest way to think about it. So if we're looking at strength as the easiest one to break down, volume would be how many sets and reps total are you doing in a session, and the intensity would be how heavy is it relative to what you could potentially lift. So an easy way to conceptualize that is what percentage of your 1 rep max are you doing those sets and reps at. And it's something we're very big on at Red Pill, and Jowsey actually did an analysis of all the well-known successful strength programs that are out there, and one of the common features between them all was that they essentially had a high volume phase, and then as you got later into the program, the volume would go down and the intensity would go up. So there's a trade-off to be made, that you can't have high volume, high intensity for a very long period of time, because that's obviously the greatest demand on the body and you can only sustain it for so long. So when you're designing somebody's program, having an idea of where they are in their season, are they peaking for competition where they need to have a certain amount of volume and intensity together, that carries the most risk but also offers the most performance. Whereas if you're away from competition, you can have a volume accumulation phase where you're not necessarily working at very high intensity, but you're building the amount of work the body's able to do. And equally, you could have a very intense phase where you're not doing as much total work, but it's much higher in terms of intensity. And for the everyday athlete, just having an awareness of whether you need to peak and you actually need to have the coexistence of volume and intensity, or you can address them in relative isolation, which is much safer, but you're not going to be in peak condition in the same way as you would be if you ramped up both simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that's really nice, where especially if you are an everyday athlete, the thought to look into your own training is that when you are looking at building strength, you are going to have to dabble in these heavier loads. So your intensity will essentially increase because you're going to be pushing yourself. However, that then normally comes with your volume dropping down, just like Ash said there. And it's like, unless you're, say, like in competitive CrossFit or say something like that, where you have to have the body primed in a state where when you turn up, you have to be able to perform at your best physically, and also be able to take the most amount of load on the body and all these other factors, because that's what it is. It's a test of your fitness and a test of your strength and so forth. Whereas as an everyday athlete, you may not have an end goal per se of, say, competing anywhere, but what you have is more like mini wins along the way, as in where you're accumulating and testing, say, your own strength and your own capacity on certain, say, exercises and so forth that you choose as a measure, essentially.
Spot on.
So I guess when we come into volume and intensity, I guess that also comes into the thoughts of, when it comes to performance overall, you have to understand that performance may start to drop if you push too hard with intensity. And I think it's that, from a coach's perspective, it's that understanding of when you are working with an athlete, their levels of intensity and how far you can push them. I guess because you obviously deal directly with quite a lot of high level athletes, as in, what have you found has been a common thing that you do or that you see other people not do, for instance?
I think this leads quite nicely into the next point as well, which is more is more. And with regards to volume and intensity, if you're a competitive athlete, doing more practice means you're going to develop faster and better than doing less practice. And so one of the things I'll do with any new athlete is to try and establish what their maximum recoverable volume is, like how much training can they do in a week, a fortnight, a month, before gains start to drop off. So the maximum recoverable volume is a concept that is the most work you can get away with. And if you go beyond the maximum recoverable volume, you actually start to get less fit, because you're damaging the body at a rate that it can't bounce back from and be ready to perform at a higher level in the subsequent sessions. If you want to be the best athlete you can be, you should be just at your maximal recoverable volume, because you're then doing as much practice as your body can physically handle, and that over time will increase your work capacity. And I think that is the other end of the spectrum to the biohacker sort of shortcut approach, which is the minimum effective dose. Like, what's the least amount of work I can do to still achieve a stimulus? And if you're not in a rush to get results, or you're not a competitive athlete trying to be the best you can be, then the minimum effective dose is like, I only have 3 hours a week to train. So what's the best bang for buck return on that time invested that I can get to achieve some sort of stimulus to make me adapt without getting anywhere near my maximal recoverable volume? And having an understanding of who you are and why you're training will dictate which end of the spectrum and how much you want to invest in your performance progress.
I guess that's just made me think of two things, actually, which I want to just bring up, which is, one, I guess steroids are one thing where you start to think about, one of the reasons why, say, a lot of these top bodybuilders and stuff like that take steroids. Yes, they get enhanced gains, but it's so that they can recover faster, so they can push harder. So they're constantly being able to push their body above and beyond what their natural physiological level can handle. So that's the whole. So this is, and then where, so you wouldn't, well, you probably would get people taking steroids and doing the minimum effective dose. It's like, okay, I'm going to do just enough, because then you're not maximizing the potential of, say, the steroids, which is just, if you then take away the steroids and any enhancements, doing just enough will only get you just by. And that might be fine for a period of time, because sometimes life gets it. Like, for instance, having a kid as an example, my training took a bit of a back seat where it was more of, you're just getting by, doing your thing until you can start peaking again and bringing your intensity back up, because my recovery was not as good as it was, say, prior to having a kid. So then those two, you've had to then learn the balance. But like, for instance, when we first had our daughter, the reality of my recovery not being as good took a little while for me to realize. So, and again, that's normal. So it's just going through it. the other thing I wanted to say was on the when you look at people like Matt Fraser and Tia Toomey, you know they're not doing the minimum effective dose. They want to be the best in the world. So that's why they are the best in the world, because they are constantly pushing themselves to just about their limits, if not probably just a little bit past them to a degree, just so they can see where they are, because they're pushing their limits. That is why they stand out in the crowd when you look at the competitive CrossFit scene. And like, but then that comes at a cost where, say, I remember seeing one of the Matt Fraser's documentaries thing where he, as an example, all he does is train. His missus will cook for him, everything. He literally trains in the gym, then chills out, trains and chills out. And then some people are like, oh, that would be the life. But it's like, the reality is, if you think training, that is his job. So that's essentially like someone going to the office, working, doing that 8-hour job. If they worked for 8 hours rather than just doing 4 hours and tossing off for another 4. But then, so you're actually, so you're getting into the office, you're working hard for 8 hours, and then you get out, and that's then your recovery. So it's finding that balance. And it's like, but that's the understanding that these to be at that level, you have to be able to push yourself. And I guess that's obviously where coaches come in and understanding like their athletes and really understanding how far they can start to push them.
Exactly. What volume can they handle?
Exactly.
One of the first things you've got to establish.
Exactly. And I think you're a good example of more versus more, because look at your one-arm pull-up. When you was practicing that, so you was practicing that pretty much every other day or doing variations and so forth, that you was doing it so often that then you was able to then build towards it. And then as soon as you went on holiday and stuff and come back, admittedly you said you had a couple of extra pounds added on.
Yeah.
But the reality is then because you hadn't been doing the skill that often, it then made you essentially lose the single arm pull-up, which I think leads nicely onto our next one, which is frequency.
Yeah. And
this is one where I think frequency gets bastardized a lot because a lot of people are scared by frequency. A lot of people are scared of doing too much, and which then it kind of goes into the more versus more thing of that, oh, I'm not going to be able to recover, this is where approaching your training with a smart strategy rather than just doing more work with no intent, because that's, I think, is really key. More is great as long as you have intent and purpose behind what you're doing, not just doing every single accessory, every single strength thing and all these things, because it's then just too much for the body to handle. But then if we then come into the next portion, which is then frequency, doing a movement often enough gives you the ability to understand how to perform it to its highest potential that you can perform it at. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think all movements are skills. They are complex motor patterns which your body has to learn to coordinate. Even a squat or a deadlift, people think of them as basic movements, but they're complex, multi-joint, multi-muscle movements which require a high degree of full body coordination. So if you do them once a week, you can make really good progress. But if you do them every day, you'll make faster progress. Obviously, there are caveats around the intensity with which you do the movements, but they are skills, and they're no different from a motor pattern point of view to a golf swing or playing tennis, where you're building coordination. And somebody who plays a bit of golf or a bit of tennis every day of the week is going to become more consistent and more effective in those motor patterns than somebody who plays once a week and has forgotten the technical pointers that they learned that week by the next time they perform the movements. And people don't often appreciate that technical skill component of what are considered basic exercises. But I think one area where people do appreciate it is Olympic weightlifting, where Olympic weightlifters will practice the snatch, the clean and jerk and squats every day pretty much, because they know that if they get out of the rhythm, the skill, they'll feel a little bit rusty, it'll just feel a little bit off. Whereas if they're in a rhythm of practice, like you said about me and my one-arm pull-up, it just feels there. It's at the tip of your fingers to just pull that motor pattern out of the filing cabinet. Whereas if it's been a while, you're a little bit rusty and you're just not as well rehearsed, as well practiced So you're not going to be as consistent in the movement, and you don't have the same degree of recruitment. And I think, that's one easy way to think about it, is whenever you contract a muscle, you're recruiting motor units. So the effectiveness with which your brain can turn on motor units, which are groups of muscle fibers, will determine the amount of strength that you can produce. And if you're well practiced at recruiting the relevant motor units, you'll have a good strength performance. Whereas if you're not, so if you're a newbie or you're rusty, your brain won't be as good at recruiting as many motor units in the optimal sequencing. And
I think when it comes to, especially with the newbies as well, is in like the understanding that frequency is probably your biggest friend, along with obviously progressive overload, but frequency, because when you're even, I'd say, even going beyond obviously newbies, but frequency in general, being able to consistently do a movement so you get good at it, and being able, but then that's where obviously loading becomes important and so forth, because it kind of touches on like the conjugate method. So anyone that hasn't ever watched it on Netflix, watch West Side v the World. So basically, West Side Barbell, the strongest gym in the world, he claims to be. Louis Simmons, an absolute animal of a man, but has produced some of the strongest humans ever. And whether that's assisted powerlifting or unassisted doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's just these people have been able to push their boundaries. Now, their idea is, Louis' idea is about that, again, that frequency and making sure they're performing movements consistently or variations of the movement. So if I just break it down into an easy, say 4 times a week training, even though it's not what they do, but say 4 times a week training, say 2 strength days where they're focusing on, say, lower body and upper body, and then 2 speed days on upper body, lower body. Now, on their strength days, they probably have their main lift at some point, but then they're also going to do loads of variations. So if using the deadlift as an example, they'll do, like, say, deadlift, say week 1, week 2 might be deadlift with chains, week 3 might be block pulls, week 4 might be something else. And then maybe 8 weeks later, they come back to heavy deadlift again. So they're loading their body through all these different movement patterns, they're loading their body multiple times a week with that hinge pattern, but maybe doing a slightly different variation, but they're still overloading their body with load, which is their key thing. They like to build their heavy 1s, 2s, and say 3s. Now, on the second part of their week, that'd be where they're fine tuning their skill. So that'd be where they do the speed work. So they'll be doing their deadlift and they'll be performing it, say, maybe with bands or so forth, and focusing on speed at a lighter load. So they're moving fast and they're moving consistently. So they don't forget that movement pattern, just like Ash said there with the toning on, like the motor unit. So I like to use the light switch analogy, where if you imagine your muscles have 10 light switches in, 10 light bulbs in, that you can only ever say access 7 unless, say, there's a baby underneath a car, then you'll access the other 3. But say, for instance, you can access 7, you want to be as good at turning on all 7 lights as possible. So the more frequent you do it, the more lights you're going to turn on. Just like, so I've just bought, we've just got a coffee machine, and I know you've, thank you. Not that I needed anything else to overload my caffeine consumption, but latte art. It's so watching the things on YouTube, all well and good, trying to practice. I remember me and Hannah did a home barista course, nailed it first time with the person there. It was great. Tried to do it here. I mean, to be fair, these look a little bit better than like Costa's and so forth, but not quite a high level specialty coffee. But it's that thing of, I've had to say to Hannah that we're going to have to use our really crappy beans that we've got so we can keep practicing, because I can't keep drinking the coffees with really good, because I need to practice more. So even taking it away from a fitness perspective and taking it out into, say, like something like being able to do some latte art on a coffee, you need that practice. You need the coordination of the wrist, the skill, there's so much to it. So it's like, it doesn't matter what area life is. I think we all know if you want to get better at something, you need to do it more. Yeah,
big time. What milk are you using, mate?
Full fat milk.
Yeah, that's the best.
I'm not gonna use anything less than that. But do you know what's surprising? So I realized, so one of the things I keep reading is I think I was overheating it, because basically it was then too thin, so then it wasn't velvety. And I love my coffee, so I'm especially a flat white. So but to be fair to myself, it looks like shit, but it tastes great. I mean, like, when you've got it's this is a whole new world. Having like basically a coffee shop coffee at home. Like this morning, I had 2 double espressos before my 7 a.m. client. So it just because it's so easy, it's great. But so we could go on and talk about coffee for a long while. But let's maybe bring it back to the fitness stuff. So I guess something else you could also when it comes to performance programming, benchmarks I think are key, because you need that idea of being able to always come back to something to measure against, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like we say it all the time, what gets measured gets managed, and your benchmarks should be key metrics so that you can keep an eye on your progress. So what do you actually care about? Like, what is the end goal of your program? Is it, well, we're talking about performance, so is it the speed with which you can do a 1K row? Is it your 1 rep max deadlift? Is it your clean and jerk? Is it for your Fran time? What type of performance are you looking to improve? And every now and again, you need to come back to test it to see if you are actually improving. You might not need to do a direct 1 rep max deadlift, but if you normally do 4x8, is your 4x8 weight going up? Then you know that your conventional deadlift is getting heavier. And I think a common pitfall that people fall into is they get carried away with all the variations, progressions, and accessories, and never come back to the core movement that matters. And Westside that you talked about just now is a great example, is that even though they use all those different styles of deadlift, bands, chains, block pulls, speed work, they will circle around and come back to the conventional deadlift, because that's what matters for a powerlifter who's competing. And you always need to be comparing apples with apples. So for sure, if it's appropriate, use as many accessory lifts and variations as necessary. But if your program is working, like, you need to be sure of that. And the same principle applies to whether it's an aesthetics program or a health-based program. You should establish key performance indicators and constantly be evaluating and course correcting if necessary.
Yeah, I think that is key. And I think the problem, it's hard because obviously with CrossFit having so many modalities, you have to then obviously, as they redefine what you are trying to say get better at, to be able to then measure against. Because if you're trying to improve your Fran time and doing heavy deadlifts, is that really going to improve your Fran time? Probably not. But then are you actively trying to improve your Fran time? So then you can't say, oh, I'm not getting fitter, because you haven't tried to get fitter, if you know what I mean. So yeah, you need to really be clear. Now, that also comes into like the powerlifting world, bodybuilding, well, not bodybuilding, really powerlifting world. It's in that doing all these different accessories, stuff like that, can be fun. And I think it's great, especially if you've got the time and because it's enjoyment, and that's part of this thing. The person that can turn up consistently is the person that's going to progress the most, compared to someone that's going to turn up and then maybe go a bit disheartened for a period of time. Obviously, this is mainly talking more about the everyday athletes, because if you're a competitive athlete, even if you get disheartened, you still show up, you do the work, otherwise you're not competitive. But making sure you're having fun, but making sure that you are still progressing, and make sure, as I said there, you've got something to measure against to make sure that you are getting better. Because if you don't have something to measure against, you're just pissing in the wind essentially and just seeing what happens. Yeah. So I just think for our listeners, just to recap, I think on everything that are considerations for programming for performance, you want to make sure you're covering progressive overload. That is king. So making sure you're improving week in and week out, month in and month out, and looking at the bigger picture rather than always looking at the day, because the days can kind of sometimes slip by. Intensity and volume, making sure you're understanding when there's an appropriate time to say peak or work towards something. And if you're not someone that needs to peak, just to make sure that you're accruing the right amount of intensity and volume needed to get better, basically, because that's what we're all trying to get. Frequency, obviously, and more is more. We want to make sure we're doing it as much as we can to get the most out of it, but also making sure that option is suitable for our current period of time. Like I mentioned earlier, with me becoming a dad, say just over 2 years ago, I was then trying to still perform and do the same type of frequency as I was prior to having a kid. So then it meant my recovery and stuff. So that was where I had to learn and understand where my current frequency is. And then benchmarks, making sure you've got yourself those key performance indicators, those things to measure against to make sure that you are moving forward. So anything else you want to add in, Ash?
That's great, mate. Nice
Beautiful
summary.
Thank you. So guys, if you did enjoy this episode, it'd be really great to hear. Please share and all that good stuff. We do like to, it gives us a little bit of a good feeling when we see these people giving us some reviews, which we've had a good few, which is really appreciative. Also, if you've got any questions, please do throw them our way. We're compiling a short fire Q&A episode. Hopefully we're also going to do another one with Liam as well from PH Nutrition. So we've got a nutrition one and a training one. So do get us those questions across so we can produce that episode. And apart from that, thank you again always for lending us your ears for this past 30 minutes. We really hope you enjoyed it and got something to take away. And until next week.
Thanks, guys.